Привет, Владимир.
Hello, Vlad. So, is there something to discuss after a break? There are a lot of international shakedowns happening that will and are affecting Russian economy. Perhaps the time of big arguments about the situation of Russian economy is upon us. Tell us what you prepared for us this week. Hello, everybody. The week is very well saturated with a ton of events. I don't even know what to start with, but I suggest let's leave all the international and geopolitical aspects for dessert, for the second part. And let's start with banal and boring, or maybe not so boring, Russian stats, because the data is rather murderous that's coming from there. And I first want to start with the Ministry of Finance that published the official budgetary deficit number for 2024. And surprise, surprise, it was higher than what was prognosticated, higher than whatever was reviewed before. And right now it's at the 3.4 trillion, almost 5 trillion rubles. And I want to remind that they increased this number about 4 times when they adopted the budget for 2024. Initially, they planned for something like 1.6 trillion. Then it was increased up to 2.1. Then in autumn, they acknowledged that they will likely break through 3 trillion. And as a result, it turned out to be 3.5. And it's a very curious aspect because right now you might be listening to a lot of commentary about fiscal conservatism and genius of Silovanov, the Minister of Finance of Russia, that they can control their budget in difficult situations, but this is bullshit. We have illustrated that many times how it is happening here. Once a few months without much fanfare and explanation, they just increase the number of deficit upwards. So, Vlad, they're not like keeping it under control, but when it basically goes above their previous prediction, they just increase the number. Is that so? Exactly that, Michael. And you can see that on the chart. That representing 4 times on the past year, they have reviewed it, and as a result, it increased the original plan by 2.2 times. And this is the degree of the accuracy of their planning within 12 to 14 months. And one can say that during the 3 years of full-scale war against Ukraine, they still cannot hold deficit lower than 3 trillion rubles. I would remind once again that this year they are planning at 1.2 again, but just having witnessed 2024, that's very skeptical. The number itself is rather shocking. If you think about it, over 3 years of the full-scale war, the overall deficit of federal budget increased over 10 trillion rubles. And I remember all the discussions that were happening before this invasion of Ukraine. And if somebody would have said that Russia would incur a 10 trillion deficit over 3 years, economists would have parried that, said, no, this is impossible. That would be an utter catastrophe in the economy. And all the perspectives will fade. And, we apparently are getting used to bad news step by step. Just look back, and this number is a very huge deficit number due to the events caused by this war. And for 11 months, they were trying to keep the deficit under some control. Even for a few months, they had some income in their budget when income was exceeding the expenses. And yet it was visible that by the end of the year, they'll likely break through and go in the red. And that's exactly what happened, 3.5 trillion deficit. And don't pay much attention to all the praising commentary about the genius of some of the Putin's cabinet. This is not so. Now, we have been watching that for the last year, and we'll continue watching it this year as well, I suspect. I also posted a separate video on my channel about the Fund of National Security, and it already dwindled, as we discussed, but it does have, besides the liquid part, also a not so liquid part. And there are some shares of companies, there's stock there, and many of them cannot even be sold, right? For example, shares of central bank government will not be selling. They cannot sell even a little bit of that because otherwise they're risking losing control over that. And also having their money in Russian tech, Russian automobile industry, and it's very questionable whether they can return them back at some point. On paper, they have them, but in reality, it turns out, or it looks like they can't access that. So once again, another fulfilled prediction that deficit had beaten all the plans that they had for it. And in the background of the full-scale warfare, it is very difficult to control it in some fashion, or any fashion. And one can say that you can take their estimates, multiply them bravely by 2, confidently, and they likely will incur even more expenses than that, than what they planned officially. And as we just see in the documents released, that's likely what will happen in 2025. And if you're curious about how much actual money they have to fund things in their reserve fund, watch my other video, that's where I'm explaining that. I think they probably will not spend the remainder of the liquid part of the National Security Fund, but they'll probably go to emission type of funding. So basically everything is burning, let's let the house burn down too. And they'll be probably creating limited emission type subsidies, right? Inflation is already high, so let's print another $1 trillion or 2 from through government banks into the budget. So that's what they likely will resort to. And we'll see that this, of course, will affect the inflationary background and inflationary rate in the country, but they don't have other options. The war requires more budgetary expenses. Military budgets and economic budgets, they require a lot more money, and they cannot control that. Vlad, do I understand it correct that deficit for 2024 is a record-breaking deficit that we have seen? Michael, I don't quite remember whether in some of the shitty years of late 90s we faced anything like that, but I'll go check. But it does look like it's the biggest deficit since the beginning of the war with Ukraine. And this is the biggest deficit, I would say, at least in the last 10 years. But I am not sure about the past crisis times, about 2008 and maybe 90s. Maybe there was some bigger deficit, but I suspect no. But the impression is that, yeah, this is the biggest deficit. 3.5 trillion, that's a big number. Think of it this way, it is bigger than all the military budget that Russia had before 2022. So military budget pre-2022, the whole military budget per year, was smaller than this deficit they incur now. Just for you to understand the scale of these numbers. This is a humongous value. And they, for 3 years already, they cannot leave these huge deficits. They continue running into the same-ish numbers year over year, and they cannot take it under control. And this is, of course, is a key matter, key reason for inflation. All right, now let's go to inflationary matters. The numbers of Russian stat finally are done with the New Year story. They switched back to weekly publications, and according to the 20th of January, weekly inflation in Russia was 0.25%. As we understand, this is a pretty high number. If anybody is to compare that with some other numbers that they previously had, 0.3, 0.5, 0.25 is not too high, but I would remind you that for over a year they were making decision whether to increase the key percent rate on the inflationary numbers much lower than that, 0.1, 0.2, and for the whole year they were increasing the rate. So this is a weekly inflation which is much higher than during the last year and a half they were addressing as high, and they were increasing the percent rate, the interest rate, to attack it somehow. Of course, due to Christmas holidays and stuff, there were no publications for several weeks. We don't know the data about the first half of January. The first number we get is from the 13th to the 20th. It's 0.25. And 0.67 was the combined inflation for the first 3 weeks of 2.5 weeks of January. So looking at that, one can conclude that inflation is still very high, continues to be very high. And there is no trend for slowdown or weakening of inflation. For example, monthly inflation, according to 20 years of January by Rosstat, is about 1%. So we're going back to 1.5% a month that we faced in November as the result of the last year. And 1% is only 20 days. So it'll be higher than last year. Inflationary background remains pretty high. Right, Vlad. And I remember they did change the method of calculations. They removed some positions, added something else. Oh yeah, indeed, Michael. They did made some funny changes there. Not nothing drastic, but it's very interesting to see what they were addressing it. They were trying to dull and hide the elements that are adding to their inflationary calculations. They didn't change it drastically, and one can tell that it's still high. I always recommend to monitor regional news, and of course, we do have our favorite chart of most expensive items, and we can see that everything is growing because of excise taxes and all the inflation. Milk and transportation, vodka is growing by 5%. Of course, excise taxes add more. There is another one brooding now about the cucumbers. Cukes cost in Russia similar to the price of meat. And by the way, pay attention to that. Remember the story we had with eggs? When there is a story unfolding about the boom of prices on certain goods, and then they sort of disappear from the news, and the prices stop to grow. After a while, the prices do come back because they are related with accumulated economic issues. And it's not like you can bring more eggs from Azerbaijan and address the deficit of these goods. There was a pause in eggs and cukes, but now you can see them coming back to our charts, to the top of it. Another fun story, one of the users of the resource Smart Lab, which is a rather large-scale economic forum online where people discuss the news of financial markets. He posted a bunch of his own receipts and calculated his personal inflation. And the compared inflation was just for the January of the last year, and the difference was 38%. Basic goods, nothing too expensive, nothing too unusual. So 38% is the real inflation, and that kind of beats with the right numbers we're telling you here, the ones that Romir stopped publishing. He had 22% when he analyzed it last time. But there were also data coming from Sirena, the media from Navalny's anti-corruption fund that do their own calculation of consumer goods and inflation. One can tell that real consumer inflation is in the framework of 35-40% year over year. And what is more important here also is that last week central bank published 2 bulletins. They're dedicated to inflation, and they have different kinds of analysis. One is called Dynamic of Consumer Prices, and the other is estimating the trends of inflation. And both documents reaffirmed what I mentioned last time, that December inflation was indeed higher than what Росстат was planning, and that real inflation was speeding up compared to November. If you remove seasonality corrections, so pre-Christmas, pre-New Year cheapening of goods before the holidays, if you remove that, you can see that, or if you account for that, you can see that inflation actually expedited in the last month of last year. So now everybody is trying to guess how it will boil at the meeting of the 14th of February, which is only about 3 weeks away, and I'm trying to track the discussions on the Russian financial market. There are very polarly different estimations of what needs to be done. Optimists are saying that, well, look, people take less credit because central bank now is observing that as the main indicator. Inflationary data is kind of bad for January and end of December, but it is not catastrophic, so maybe we won't increase the rate again. And pessimists are saying, similar to what we repeated here again, that inflationary background is still very high. It is higher than all the historic trends, and it is not coming down. So if central bank indeed wants to continue acting in the same fashion they've been attacking this matter last year, they cannot not increase that in February. But as we know, the phone management by phone is not cancelled in Russia. It's still very much alive and well, so they may get a phone call from above telling them not to. But overall, the backdrop is pretty bad. So if you're being objective, one can say that central bank needs to raise the rate in February. But we also know that there are a lot of powerful people who have direct line to Putin, and Putin has direct line to Nabiullina. So that web of direct lines, that it does affect the objective estimations of probability one way or the other. So let's wait till February 14th and see what happens. Also, yesterday, Central Bank published a bulletin which is called Monitoring of the Companies of the Industries, where they ask from 15 to 12,000 different companies. There's a questionnaire, and they all project the business climate of Russia to be going deeper, lower. Is it not in the minus yet, Vlad? Oh, it's going there. It's 3.8 in January. In December, it was 4.3. And you can see that table on the screen. The second quarter of last year, for your understanding, was 10.5. So you can see how it continues to go down. In December, it was 4.2. Now it's 3.8. So it continues to go down. And one can see that on the backdrop of all the recent events, there is no optimism left. And we are waiting for more stats to come. Perhaps next week we will have more data on December performance of different industries in Russia, and we'll probably see more info about slowdown of economy sectors. And this continues to happen. The prices and the inflation keeps galloping, and it's difficult for companies to operate in this market. And when we will discuss, for example, in comparison with other countries, for example, Turkey, by Russia, they're using to scare people with their rate, but Turkey is actually on the down spiral with their rate. Argentina is also decreasing the bank interest rate. Russia is going in the other direction. Another interesting information about gasoline, what we discovered in January, is that Russian oil producers, drum intro here, they got almost 2 trillion, 2 trillion rubles from budget last year on the mechanism of fuel damper, when they're getting paid directly from budget, so they would not increase the prices at the pump. Meanwhile, the prices at the pump are still growing. They grew by 11.1%, but they exceeded the rate of inflation, official inflation, by 1.6. And they also got 2 trillion in their pockets directly as the budgetary compensation. So, wait, Vlad, so the prices on gasoline de facto are much higher, just people don't see it because this is not what's written on the signs at the gasoline station, but the gasoline manufacturers are getting money directly from budget. Exactly, Michael. And one can say that this is just another contribution to inflation, just from another angle. In the previous scheme, the prices for gas would have been just growing. And this way, they're just increasing the federal deficit, and they have to spend money from National Reserve Fund. And some of the comments under my last stream were good. They actually noted correctly that that spending of money from National Security Fund is not really different from monetary emission, because you take some money mass, some financial mass that was somewhere on the shelf, and now it's dumped onto the country's economy, changing prices there. And that's why I do not like these non-market mechanisms, because what's the difference? You either affect inflation via direct price growth for gasoline, or you're doing it behind the curtains via the huge deficit of the budget and spending your reserves on this. Well, Vlad, let's take the Scandinavian countries, for example. They also use this reserve money, but they do buy international stock, and they buy more investment property, investment mechanism. So I understand when that can be used in case of a big crisis, when it's easy to create a one-time emission, but it is not spread in time, so it doesn't have deep inflationary consequences, in my understanding, right? Well, look, Michael, there are two elements here. First of all, in Scandinavian countries, the prices are pretty high, and this is a very uncomfortable story there. It's just the reality. It creates a lot of difficulties for people to live there, and this is also partly in relation to the fact that, say, Norway has too much oil money. On the other hand, they indeed are doing something different than Russia. They are investing this extra money. For example, that Norwegian fund, government pension fund, is one of the biggest investments in the international investment market. And they're paying their pensions from the profits of this fund. They're not taking extra income from recent years, and they don't dump that into economy to support current budget. They actually purchase different investment vehicles. Right, that's what I was saying, Vlad, that there are different ways of using it. I agree with you, Michael. So de facto, we can see that this gasoline damper. This is not really holding inflation. It actually is speeding it up in a different fashion. But the oil producers, they get pretty good money from the budget. Here is 2 trillion from the budget, right? So the other companies, no, you're not getting. You're getting a salty dick from that, but you guys in the oil industry will support you. What else? Minister of Finance got done a couple more auctions on the limited bonds, and the required profitability is now at 17%. This actually tells you that despite of all the optimism about Trump, which they were peddling in Russia, the market is projecting into the future the inability of the government to pay, to be good on its debts. That's why they require the profitability to be pretty high. And this also outlines that the path of funding the budget via emissions, via banks, to have certain limitations, right? Because the banks do require profitability as well. And that implies that Minister of Finance will have to compensate them for it. And it will ultimately affect the deficit as well. And it does cost a lot. This mechanism will result in affecting inflationary processes and, again, dismantling of the budget balance. And they will run out of money faster. So one more thing I wanted to note here before we go to international is sanctions. And a couple of different things here. Remember, there were waves of from sanctions. When the sanction is adopted, it takes a bit for this wave to actually hit Russian economy. But remember in November when they, in the United States, added about 50 banks to the list of black banks that they don't want to deal with and limited interactions with. So that made it more difficult for export profits to get to Russia. And those calculations for importing goods and exporting goods, they have to use intermediaries because most of the major banks are in the sanction list. And that affected the extra expense on these operations from 5 to 20% for all these transactions. And this will not kill the transactions themselves, but all these sanctions, they do snowball and they do make the chain of economy operations in Russia, they do make it more expensive, and they do affect the business climate. That actually does directly affect that, because many entrepreneurs are saying that why the heck do we even want to bother with this if the profitability is so low and every sanction will affect it and will keep it more risky and will increase our expenses for intermediaries. And with tankers, you're also probably seeing that all that gray tanker fleet is on a slowdown because of the recent January American sanctions. One can see that the tariffs for renting these tankers had increased by 15 to 30% extra. Now they're trying to use some other tankers and trying to find ways around it as it's getting more expensive. So from all different sides, sanctions against the banks, sanctions against the gray tanker fleet, the expenses are growing for the agents in Russian economy. And another factor that creates a pressure on ruble and weakens it, I wanted to show this chart. This is the trade balance of Russia. See how the trade balance is shrinking. This is their income from import and export. If at the beginning of full-scale invasion into Ukraine, they were getting $20 to $30 billion profit monthly from the balance between export and import. Last year, it came down to about 10 and change. And last month of 2024, Russia had only about $6 billion monthly. And in December, it was less than 6. So that continues to decrease, continues to dwindle. The balance of income and deficit on the international trade. Essentially, we're paying so much extra expenses to conduct these import operations that our exports are barely covering that, and we get only about 5 or 6 billion rubles as a result on top. And that's why ruble is weakening still. There was another number that in December, the profits from export decreased in annual expression by 19%. And this is a one-time number. Overall, the export in 2024 was more or less in the framework of what they expected it to be. It was declining, but generally within the expectation. And in December, the significant drop of export indicates that some of the recent sanctions actually hit them pretty hard. And this is about the matter of why ruble is now trading at a higher than 100 rubles per dollar. It did fortify its position a little bit last week, but we'll talk about that a little later. So sanctions, they do decrease currency that Russia is getting from outside economic activities, and that does put the extra price tag on everything they do. Another interesting thing I wanted to address, I had a lot of questions sent to me, and there was a situation with a big fake of Russian independent media. You might have seen the headers where they were saying that Russia got record profit from oil and gas in 2024. And I did remember, Vlad, that you calculate that, they do calculate it by the overall loads of oil into the transport vessels. It does look a bit strange, I guess. So I was waiting for that time when you can explain. Yeah, that piqued my interest. So let's take a look at oil. Here is some data of the International Energy Agency on the export of oil. And the export of oil in Russia in physical expression was in negative, 350,000 barrels per day lesser. In price, it was equivalent. It was about the same, plus maybe $2 billion, but roughly $190 billion. So it's the similar price as last year. In gas, they had a little bit of profit, a little bit of growth. They've sold 28 billion cubic meters to Europe. In 24, they sold 32. So compared to 23, it's a little on the plus side, but still a very small number compared to the pre-war parameters. And I decided to dig deeper into this. The original of publication for this was on a channel Ferry Daily of Rustamova, and it was not incorrectly written, but what she was talking about is that oil and gas profits of Russian budget were record-breaking, 11 trillion. And there were no two disclaimers that should have been mentioned there. That first is, yes, this is the number which they had in 2022 when Russia got record money, but this is in rubles. And ruble, remember, in 22 was 50. These days, it's 100. So you divide these 11 trillions in half, and you get a very far from record-breaking amount as the result. That's the first disclaimer. Second is taxes. So oil and gas income of the budget in Russia, they are also affecting the taxation situation. In the same level of exports as 23 and 24, they've gathered more money from the same exports than they did before. So that's how Russian budget generates money on sales, through taxes. And however it was presented, so we gathered more money from about the same amount of oil and gas that we sold the year before, but we gathered more taxes than the year before. So that's how it is important to bring the light onto that. Russia is not selling more. We just saw that in the numbers. Russia is just, Putin's government just figured out how to squeeze more taxes from what they sold. And it also has a negative side, of course, because we have seen that, and we demonstrated here that oil and gas companies, they limit their investment programs as the result of taxation, and this will affect the volumes of production down the road. So overall, this news is not a good news. This news actually is telling that Putin, in order to balance his budget, needs to squeeze oil and gas market even more. So generally, it's a bad thing for him. But yeah, it was presented as Russia made more money, as if Putin is a champion who outplayed and outsmarted everybody. I would just request here from media that be accurate, be careful with what you quote. That yes, 11 trillion is a big number, but there is a nuance to that, including these two that I just mentioned. And it's important in economy to indicate that, otherwise people get a wrong impression and negative impression of different from the real situation. And now I want to talk about the international aspect. Let's go take a look at Trump. Now let's see whether Vladimir Milov is still supporting the Biden camp or whether he is more in the Trump camp now. Well, three moments I wanted to highlight here. They expected Trump to increase customs tariffs. He did mention that he will be increasing them from day one against China, Canada, EU, Mexico. Right, they're expecting about 25% or something like that. And here there is some unknowns. People are expecting the increase of his tariffs since February. The markets are exhaling. Nothing worse has happened yet, and there are several interesting aspects of this story. First, that he slow walks that is that perhaps indicating that he understands that these steps may incur negative consequences. And this is not good for him. So, roughly speaking, if you want to hit something, you hit something, right? And I apologize for the expletives used. And if you start to blink and start to have concerns, then China, for example, is making its own conclusion that Trump did promise a lot during elections, but he also understands that there are weak elements to these decisions and that there'll be negative consequences to those decisions. That means that perhaps China can continue pressing him more, and likely he is concerned with them. So by delaying the implementation of tariffs, which he promoted before, that actually bites off his image of a brave fella. So, Vlad, isn't it a negotiating position? I think that was the way he talked with North Korea. First, he told them, I'll crumble you, I'll make you a dust, and then suggested that let's discuss. So maybe he wants to first talk to Xi Jinping and perhaps use the rates to achieve a certain deal. Right. I think North Korea example here indicates that North Korea managed to get certain benefits from this deal. They got him into the web of negotiations for the sake of negotiations, waited for his exit from the White House, and have been continuing their line for the last 4 years under Biden. So for those whom Trump considered to be his opponents, that is a very working tactic, just to wait it out. And they can see that he can get engaged into negotiations, and he thinks that negotiations are also valuable, and likely they can drag him into prolonged negotiations to perhaps limit the degree of heat that he was intending to put on them initially. And I think that's what we will see from China being played out very soon. And he put him in a difficult situation that he either needs to increase the tariffs, which will lead to certain negative aspects in the economy, or slow walking implementation of tariffs would highlight that he understands certain risks that it will have on the economy. And the fact, if you do not slap the tariffs immediately as you promised, that indicates your weakness in this aspect that his opponents might use if they want to, because, that's a legit tactic to get into negotiations and slow walk them forever. This is what Hitler was doing with Munich Agreement and with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as well, through negotiations to lull your opponent into believing that you're cooperating. So the society at large, international, is expecting the tariffs. I think the tariffs will happen. And this was one of the main elements of his administration coming to power. Likely they'll be implemented in February, but that pause is interesting. Perhaps it indicates that he understands limitations and consequences of some of these tariffs, that consequences may be not only positive, but also negative. Second is his ultimatum to Putin, where he said that you either go for peace with Ukraine or what? Because Trump, in his ultimatum, he formulated this statement as an ultimatum, but that significant threat of additional tariffs for Russian products is very strange, because Russia doesn't quite trade with the United States directly anymore. As ex-Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, is writing, he is saying that Putin will not be too impressed, because Russia is not really exporting anything. So that's an interesting question. Trump could have suggested a real economic threat here, and when he is threatening additional tariffs, Well, he made that a day later in Davos, right? Very interesting point, Michael. Did you watch his speeches? I did, and I have a very specific impression. So his speech is usually sounding like this. He gets the question of Mr. Trump, you said that you wanted to stop the war of Russia with Ukraine, and you want to exert certain pressure on Putin and Zelensky to get them to negotiate a ceasefire. And he answers, yes, I do want to stop the war in Ukraine. Because, you know why? Because I saw how the war is going, and this is horrible. This is a horrible war. I've seen how big missiles are hitting civilian buildings, destroying them, demolishing completely. I was involved in developers business and development business. I know how much it takes to build one, and imagine destruction of the 20-something story building by a missile, and people have died there, and that goes for about 10 minutes. And then he gets a critique or additional question, so what about peace? And then he goes talk about peace, and so he kind of puts a lot of vignettes on this discussion. And I always recommend to take some publications when they drum up certain phrase from Trump's statement that can be interpreted as a threat to Putin, as not a threat to Putin. But if you watch the whole block of his speech, you can see that this was not exactly a threat, and it was not exactly clearly communicated what is wanted or what will be the suggested solution to that. And very often there's a lot of weaving done around the message that he is making. So it's difficult to predict exactly. Well, while I agree with you, Vlad, to a degree, there was still a threat because he did ask OPEC and Saudi Arabia to decrease oil, and he's actually expressing his concern. Why did they not decrease the oil prices before? This was not, as he said, not good of them. So that's what people are discussing because that was the most concrete suggestion. And he did not explain how he will achieve that, but at least this is something that can be, that's something palpable, that you can see that, decrease in oil prices will be a significant threat for Russia, but can Trump theoretically achieve that? All right, Michael, there were two things with a short interval. First, he wrote a post on his Truth Social about war where he said that Putin needs to finish this war, otherwise I will implement tariffs against him. And second is a statement from Davos International Economic Forum where he used a different threat. Well, no, not exactly a different, Vlad. Not that I'm defending him, but now we're getting money from the Republican side of America, I guess. But what they're saying is that they will be using tariffs and other countries as mechanism to affect Russia. And technically, OPEC and Saudi Arabia are the other countries, right? They're not really buying anything from Russia, but they can affect the situation in Russia by changing the oil prices on the international market. So I agree with you that situation is somewhat diluted, and it's not exactly a roadmap to discuss with high degree of precision. Right, that's what I'm suggesting to differentiate here. These are two different instruments. First instrument that he suggested is tariffs. And in tariffs, he's talking about other countries. So basically, European Union, even though he doesn't like EU, doesn't like to mention them. Well, I would have added India and China here, Vlad, too. Why don't we? Well, first of all, because India and China will probably not implement any tariffs on Russian goods because it's going to hurt them themselves. They are the ones buying the Russian goods because they're buying them at a big discount. And tariffs, they destroy that whole story. And it's not quite clear why would they do it. If they did not join sanctions earlier, why would they implement tariffs? Well, Trump may threaten them with something. Okay, so talking about tariffs, when you present a significant and loud threat, but then you use a very weak instrument to back your statement, like I will tariff Russian exports into America. There is no Russian exports coming to America. Everybody noticed that and commented on that immediately. So that threat has a big head, but doesn't have arms or legs, and it lacks instruments to implement it. And his standard practice is to threaten countries with tariffs, but this is not working, not going to fly with Russia, because Russia doesn't export anything to America. And here it can be an indicator of several things. First of all, is that he has some additional instruments which he's not mentioning, but right now he's starting weak. And we can see in the reaction in Moscow that with tariffs on the US exports, they're not scared with that. They're just expecting, they're in pause, expecting more to come from Trump. Now, who could have participated in tariffs? And that was discussed in EU, is creating a big trade embargo and additional tariffs on everything that EU is purchasing from Russia. Maybe that could have been a reality, but given how complex is relation between Trump and the EU, this is probably the moment when he needs to offer something else and perhaps start negotiations, but nothing is happening of that kind. So I can see that Moscow is taking this threat as something ethereal, that there's no real threat to them at the moment. They do not consider China and India to be a real threat to implement any tariffs on Russian goods, because then why do they even need anything from Russia? They're buying Russian goods only, not for quality, but because it's cheaper. So the other story, and on one hand, he basically produced a threat towards Putin, but did not offer economically understandable instrumentation how to achieve that, how he will punish Russia. So that punishing element was very weak and was very unconvincing. And you, even in your question, Michael, we can hypothetically discuss here. He can maybe involve China and India, maybe, but he has not said that. And whatever he had said looks rather weak. And the other version is that he may not even understand fully the real situation of trade between Russia and the United States, that tariffs will not really work. Well, the less he understands, if that's the reality, then it's easier to deceive him for Putin. Now, about oil, and a very important aspect here, because I do like to track that as an important factor. It's not the first time that he mentions oil, that he will, for different reasons, affect the OPEC countries to increase their oil production to lower the global oil prices. And he does have political ability to press this through. What's that second track here? This is very upsetting for American oil companies. They're super upset with that. And here he's in contradiction. He's in counterposition because American oil is much more expensive than OPEC's. So OPEC can easily decrease the price down to $50. And they can swallow that, not with pleasure, but they know how to survive. They can go through $40 or $50, fine. But in the United States, a good half of shelf oil production will close. And you can see that in American press noting every time when Trump is talking about oil prices reduction, well, American oil producers, they shiver. And it's almost visible on the, so much that it probably can be registered by seismic stations, how the top managers of American oil companies shiver. And here he has very significant contradiction to which he is not giving an answer yet, because he was being elected on the agenda of supporting oil business, removing ecological limitations and the like. And the oil business is telling him, Comrade Trump, all your rhetoric about lowering down the prices for oil, we do not really like it because we'll have to close. And last week, an important moment, the numbers of American drilling sites has diminished a little bit. Even the current price of oil is not comfortable for them. I'm not even talking about lowering it further. Now, for Putin, of course, the oil price going down will be mostly uncomfortable and untimely. But we remember that at the beginning, after the European embargo, the price of oil went down significantly in 2023, and euros was falling lower than $50 a barrel. That did not stop the war. Does it affect the politics? Yes, it does. But the very straight line between lowering the oil prices and stopping the war, this is also traditional simplification that Trump used. It is an important factor. It is a big factor, but it is not enough. To stop this war, you need more and more complex tools of pressure on Putin. You cannot, unfortunately, achieve it with one lever, even though this is a big one. And we also discussed at the beginning of the year the mechanism of forming the oil prices in the world. If the prices fall down too far and a lot of American shelf oil disappears from the market, it then brings the oil price back with vigor and it grows, it balances that. So the deficit of America providing oil will bring to a foreseeable horizon trend when the price of oil will eventually rise again. And I guess we could tag this part of a stream unasked advice from Vladimir Milov. But my advice here is do not primitivize the fight with Putin. And we can see that in Trump's rhetoric that he's looking for an important but single button. And I think the lesson of the last 3 years is that the pressure on Putin is a very complex, multifaceted, multi-criterial moment. One would need to approach him from all sides, close the banks, attack his gray tanker fleet, achieve implementation and precise implementation of different sanctions already implemented, and an attempt to find a single button. To me, I think it's clear that there is no such button, really. Well, Trump for now is still looking for that. And I think that these movements of the first days, they may be more in harm than in help of this situation with war, because in Moscow they make conclusions. I think one of them is he is not clear on the picture. That means we can probably deceive him and shove him something down his way that perhaps can deceive him far enough and buy us more time. And the measures that he voiced so far, customs tariffs of US against Russia, doesn't affect anything for Putin. Oil prices reduction, yeah, maybe we'll probably survive that somehow, but American shelf oil will probably go bankrupt. That's how they see it in Moscow. That's why I would recommend here to not look for some simple headline type levers and work with a more complex campaign as it was done before. We'll see. I think Trump is leading in a slightly different vector, but we will see. Vlad, I agree with you in the economic part. I do not agree with you on Trump's statements that it's bad. Maybe I had very low expectations of him, but the fact that he is dropping an ultimatum on Putin and puts some balls on the table, proverbially speaking, but that at least will essentially not let him remove them from the table too fast. What we know about Trump, his approach, his ego, it'll probably be the vector that he will continue. So he will continue pressuring Moscow, which is good. We can see that Vlad is not fully in the Trump camp. Unlike me, I'm changing in flight. I'm now supportive of Trump, but Vlad is still taking cautionary position. Okay, so let's see if indeed he can come up with something indeed threatening for Putin and present them, materialize those threats that will affect Putin's regime. Is that so, Vlad? Do you agree? Absolutely. And frankly, I think that Trump might actually quarrel with Putin and have a certain rivalry on this topic and act rather sternly against Putin's interest, despite what Putin was maybe subtly expecting from him. But I think that this commentary that Trump may be a very uncomfortable partner for Putin, I think this is very probable. Two things I just implore to do is not to get enchanted prematurely. Do not jump on some significant single-line commentary that Trump changed his direction and maybe added something new and now Putin is done with. And try to continue analyze economically the real economic fulfillment of his threats, which so far has been unfortunately rather weak than the noise that was created around it. But again, let's see. Reality is a interesting thing. This is very unpredictable situation, very intriguing. Good news that he did not go for canceling of any sanctions. And he actually is amping the rhetoric and amping attacks on Putin. Putin is cunning. He is analyzing the weaknesses, and I'm thinking they'll try to use these weaknesses in Trump's position in the near future. Other things I want to mention, that the news this week was that a lot of world news media talked about that according to Russian Central Bank, Russians have a record amount of credit to pay to the banks they owe, over 600 billion rubles, and this is not the amount that they already in foreclosure or in default. This is just the regular amount that they are supposed to be paying. That's how much they owe and how much they're trying to pay. What it tells us that Russians borrowed a ton. And this is not surprising. We've seen it growing. We understand that the credit load was growing and was actually galloping in the last few years, and we talked about this credit bubble. Russians are trying to pay for their credit, and they're even ready to shrink their consumption in order to close their credits and pay for them. But the credit pressure is significant, and this is a huge amount of money that continues to exert pressure on family budgets in the country. And this can grow into a full-scale crisis if the economic situation will only get worse and get worse faster. If there'll be a decline in growth of economy, and it'll be more difficult for population of Russia to pay for these credits. I do not agree with those who interpret this news as Russians cannot pay their banks. No, this is not so. This number is basically a rolling number. This goes over the total amount owed that is not past due. They maybe will be paid at the end of this month. They just have not been paid yet. But this indicates how fantastically the credit load has grown in Russia. And we will get back to this topic in our next streams, because I'm expecting at the end of January the data from Central Bank summing up the activities of 2024, the overall credits and how well they were paying for. So of course we'll analyze it and talk about it. What else? Oil, by the way, is indeed getting cheaper. While we're writing this stream, it's now at $76 per barrel. And you remember that last couple of weeks it was overreaching even 80. And it is not connected with anything special, just that the oil bulls, the ones who are trying to bring the prices up, they continue pushing the prices on the oil market up, very often using some rumors and some news, and it may go up a bit, but then it deflates when these news do not materialize. And this is an ongoing story. There are no really solid reasons for oil to become more expensive, for the price to grow, and I think it will continue returning to its price somewhere near 70-ish around the barrel of Brent. And ruble fortified a little bit. Last week it costs in Russia slightly less than 100 rubles per dollar. Again, a lot of questions to me in this regard, and I appeal to all of you to remain calm. It will definitely go back up. And we back up meaning it'll cost more than 100. And we're talking about the dwindling of export balance, that their export profits cannot cover or barely cover how much they pay for imports. And the situation will only continue to get worse. So this is only a temporary respite, a January pause on this market. Some exporters, like Russian oil, were selling some currency, and there were fewer payments for the imports in January. This is just situational fortification of ruble. It will go back significantly to over $100 rubles per dollar. So it will continue its free fall, and just remain calm. The trend of ruble is very negative, and we're continuing to monitor it. Next week we probably will have more news about the slowdown of economy, about banks, and we will discuss that then. Thank you very much, Vlad. We'll see you later. Thank you guys for tuning to our stream. I appreciate your support. If you like what you hear, do not forget, please, to click the like button and subscribe to the channel. This is the only support we ask of you. And yeah, stay with us. We'll be bringing you more news that seldom covered in this light in the main media. And we're trying to pick the most interesting of these streams covering the situation in that part of the world. Privateer out.